Okay, everybody, I'm going to sort of start my introductions. Welcome to this year's Mental Wealth Festival. We're now on the second day. For those of you who've been to other of our events, then welcome back. For those of you new to the festival, every year for the last 6 years, we have hosted an event which originally started as 2 days and now is extended for a whole week. Highlighting all aspects of mental health and well-being. And when Baroness Sheila Hollins kind of came to us with the idea, she's patron of the festival, when she came to us 5-6 years ago and said, I've got this idea that mental health is always looked as a deficit model. Could we talk about both, obviously, the issues around mental health, but also the positive sides of mental health and how things can be mitigated and ameliorated? And the last 5 years, we've had events in City Lit as a college. We've also had events in Parliament, the British Museum, the National Gallery, the Corporation of London's Guildhall. So we usually try and get around London and include as many people as possible. One of the things that we've found this year, the challenges with the pandemic has meant that we've come virtual, but it's also given us a huge opportunity not only to reach for people outside London, but also to have speakers from all around the world. So that's been a positive. Obviously, we have the various challenges around the technology, et cetera, but we're getting there, which is great. The other thing is that we've been able to get some amazing speakers who would probably been jetting all around the world and unable to actually come to us physically. And we're able to get them because they're able to give us an hour and a half of their time from their comfort of their living rooms. And one such person is the truly spectacular Noreena Hertz. Noreena and I met at a conference about 6 or 7 years ago when she was talking about this book. I was saying to her before that I was convinced she'd signed it for me, but I was absolutely really upset today when I kind of got it off the bookshelf and decided that she hadn't. So we have a promise that she's going to do it when we're allowed out again. That book was marvelous. It talked about how to make good decisions in a world overloaded by data. It was very of the moment then. And that's what Noreena is. I mean, she is somebody who sees trends in society and looks at what they're going to do and writes books and does a lot of research around them. So I'm on Noreena's list, and she announced that she had a new book coming out, and I thought, wow, title, really interesting. So I read more about it, and here it is, The Lonely Century. I think you all know that because you've all signed up today. It's a truly fabulous book. It's fascinating, it's insightful, it's thought-provoking on many levels. And I reached out to Noreena and sort of said, look, I'd love for you to join us because the Mental Wealth Festival is all about aspects of society, well-being, mental resilience, and this is what the book's about. It couldn't be more appropriate for what we're trying to achieve. So here she is. She is truly amazing, and over the course of the next 55 minutes, we're going to ask lots of questions. Now, I'm going to just give normally I'd be, if we were in the college and in the theatre, I'd be telling you where the fire escape was, etc., etc. I don't have to do that, but what I was going to tell you was, because of the big numbers and the nature of Zoom, we're going to say where I'm going to ask Noreena questions, but I'm also going to encourage you to ask questions. But if you could do it through the queue, if you can go to the bottom of your page and click on the Q&A box. If you have a question, I will try and keep an eye on the Q&A box. And what I'll try and do is aggregate questions, try and look at what's come up, add to the ones that I want to ask Noreena. But if we could do it through that, because putting your hand up, trying to go through the chat box is much more problematic for us. So if you're willing to do that, I'd just really like to welcome Noreena. Hello, Noreena, how are you?
Mark, I'm so happy to be doing this event. Mental health is such an important issue, and the fact that you're doing this festival again this year and have managed to kind of make it work so well virtually is is a real accolade. And I'm also a big fan of City Lit and all the work that you do. So, so I couldn't be happier to be in conversation with you today.
So everybody can now tell why I love her, which is marvelous. One last housekeeping note, we have captioning. So if at the bottom you want captions, we have the wonderful Julie doing speech to text. And for those of you who would like to kind of see what's going on, that's an available service for everybody. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is kind of start fundamentally at the beginning. You have a broad, very interesting definition of loneliness. This is probably wider than the average definition. Do you want to talk us through what you believe loneliness is and how we should approach the subject?
Sure. Well, when we think about loneliness, we typically think about a feeling of being bereft of friends, of company, of intimacy, a feeling of being disconnected from maybe our family or our colleagues at work. And of course, that is what loneliness is. A feeling also of feeling unsupported by those closest to us. Yes, that is loneliness, and that is the traditional definition of loneliness. But I believe loneliness is that and more. Loneliness to me is also about feeling disconnected, not only from our friends and family, but also from our fellow citizens. It's about feeling unsupported, not only by our friends and colleagues, but also by our employer, our government, the state. For me, loneliness is political as well as personal, societal as well as singular. And I've come up with this definition, this expanded definition of loneliness, not in a complete vacuum, because there are many, very impressive and important thinkers of the past, whether we're thinking about Max Weber or Amitai Etzioni or even Karl Marx, who thought about loneliness in this kind of bigger sense. And I guess I'm building on that tradition as I expand my definition of loneliness in this way.
Yeah, so that's great. And that's a big, tell me just to be blunt, why should we care about loneliness? Why does it matter?
Well, firstly, the scale of the problem can't be overstated. 40% of Brits, and this is even before the pandemic struck, felt lonely sometimes or often. Young people, actually surprisingly, perhaps, are the loneliest of all. Half of 10 to 15-year-olds feel lonely, often or sometimes. 60% of 18 to 34-year-olds feel lonely, often or sometimes. So the scale of the problem is really significant. And we think of loneliness as predominantly being a mental health issue. And of course it is. And there are links, clear links between loneliness and feelings of anxiety, feelings of depression, even at the extreme, suicide. But loneliness is also a physical health problem, something we don't often think about. And the research is really quite compelling on this. When we're lonely, what happens is our blood pressure goes up, our pulse rate goes up, our levels of cortisol, the stress hormone in our saliva, which can be measured, goes up. Our ability to fight infection goes down, our inflammation markers go up, all of those contributing to physical damage that loneliness wreaks on our bodies. In fact, loneliness is as bad for our physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So loneliness is, it's a huge problem for us personally, physically and psychologically, but it also is a problem that has really profound societal ramifications as well.
So tell me, is it a Western phenomenon, or is it something that is kind of worldwide at this point? Is this just a consequence of the nature of Western society, etc., or is this something that's becoming a problem? Is this a kind of an epidemic worldwide?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I actually looked into as I was doing my research. I think unambiguously there is a link between how lonely people are in most societies in the world and the dominance of a very particular form of capitalism that really took hold from the 1980s onwards. A form of capitalism called neoliberalism, which was the form of capitalism that was championed by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan back in the 80s, and really became the dominant form of capitalism, a form of capitalism that was really about putting the self first, a I-focused form of capitalism that really encouraged us to be competitors, not collaborators, hoarders, not sharers, takers, not givers. A form of capitalism that changed the way we saw each other in many regards. There was fascinating research done which looked at song lyrics and how they've changed since the 1970s. And if you look at song lyrics, whereas in the 1970s, many song lyrics used third person pronouns. So we, our, us, we are the champions. Queen in 1977. We will be heroes, David Bowie. What happened since the 1980s is that steadily we saw song lyrics even becoming more I-focused. So words like I, me, my, replacing we, our, and us. And what was fascinating, because this speaks to your question about how global is this, is that even in China, we see this taking hold. So even in a country where the state still has obviously retained kind of significant control, we saw this capitalist, but particularly a particular form of capitalism, I would argue, this kind of particularly harsh form of capitalist, I-focused ideology taking hold as that ethos even spread there. And so today, when I look at loneliness figures across the world, actually I see rising loneliness pretty much everywhere in the world now. So it's not exclusively a Western phenomenon by any means.
And so take a little step back 2 years ago when you started writing and researching. What was the trigger point for you to, what were the things that started to make you go, hang on, we have an issue here? What started? And then let's talk about the evolution of, obviously, this book has incredible resonance, just having been in lockdown, possibly going into another form of lockdown, etc. So to tell us the journey of the book, because I find that fascinating.
So it was really three very different aha moments happening kind of quite close to each other. So first, I was teaching at university, and I had been teaching for many years at university. And what I realized a few years ago was that my students were coming to my office in office hours, and they were confiding in me how lonely and isolated they felt. This wasn't something that had happened in the past. So there was something going on with my students. And I also observed when I set them group assignments, that many were finding it very challenging to interact face-to-face in person with each other. And again, this was a very new phenomenon. And actually, I was at a dinner with the president of one of America's most famous universities, and I mentioned that observation to him, and he said, we're finding exactly the same thing here. In fact, it's so bad here, he told me, that we are having to run how to read a face in real life classes, like literally where for our incoming students, literally if you're in a room and you're in a meeting and somebody smiles, that means that what you're saying is being positively received. And if they're frowning, that means that it's not going well. He said they're literally having to do that. So I thought, okay, something is going on with young people. Then in my academic research, I had become increasingly interested in the rise of right-wing populism. In why was it that so many people were voting for people like Trump in America, Le Pen in France, Salvini in Italy? And I wanted to dig into that. So I started digging into the academic literature on this, and also doing interviews directly with right-wing populist voters. And from both the academic research and also my own interviews, what was coming out time and time again was how lonely and disconnected this constituency was. So again, something's, going on here. And then the third insight came out of my interest in the rise of artificial intelligence and robots. And I could see that there was a growing demand in the market for robots to really serve as friends, carers, companions to people. This is typically for elderly people, and it's something that's biggest in Japan. So in Japan, you even see elderly women knitting bonnets for their robot carers. And I saw this growing demand, kind of a market-based demand, for robots to alleviate loneliness, which again signaled there's a problem here. So it was these three very distinct and different things going on that made me think, is loneliness the prism through which we can understand some of these kind of seismic shifts we've seen in recent years, societal and political? Is there something going on here where emotions are shaping our present world in a way that we haven't quite realized up until now? And that was really the incentive for spending 2.5 years in self-isolation, writing and researching my book way before the whole world joined me. Yeah.
So then, and how did you, because you talk about the pandemic and lockdowns in the book, but you obviously a lot of the work precedes that. How did your observations, your thoughts either crystallize or kind of change over the last 6 months in terms of just obviously an extreme form of imposed loneliness and isolation on so many people?
Yeah, so loneliness and isolation became our shared experience, and in such a kind of profound way and such an extreme way. And I was actually pretty close to finishing the book in March when lockdowns happened here, and spent March through June really weaving COVID throughout the book. And in a way, what was so surprising was how easy it was to do it, because the trends that I'd already identified were just, if anything, accelerating and being amplified. So I'd already been thinking a lot about what we lose when we migrate our interactions online, when we buy a book on Amazon rather than go to our local bookstore, when we order in on Uber Eats rather than going to our local cafe. And I'd already started to think about what are the implications of this for society, and realizing that that was playing, this rising contactless living was playing a really significant part in the rise of loneliness. But of course, we then ended up in a situation where, many of us were if we were able to do shopping online or order something in occasionally online, that became actually a bit of a lifeline for many people. So, but it was accelerating. In the United States, there was a fascinating piece of research that showed that 40% of people who bought groceries online in March had never bought groceries online before in the United States. So some of the trends were things that I'd already seen. But I think what it meant was that loneliness was suddenly something that was so profoundly our shared experience. And even though the baseline had already been high, so already 60% of Brits were feeling lonely, what happened and what the early research since March has shown is that people started feeling even lonelier. Loneliness levels trebled amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, for example, in May 2020 here in the UK.
So do you think that, we can go two ways with this, and it's probably a bit both, is at lunchtime we had a panel with the chief executive of Mind, the mental health charity. He said, one of the things that he found interesting and a little heartening was the fact that as soon as lockdown was announced, there was a lot of talk about people's mental health right at the beginning. And we were talking, basically, it was a panel talking about what had changed in the 5 years since we established the Mental Wealth Festival. And he said he doesn't think 5 years ago, he thinks by the end of lockdown, people would have been talking about it, but not flagging early on. that this was an issue. He sort of said that was quite heartening, that there is now a literacy and a common currency around mental health that wasn't there before. Do you think that lockdown is going to make it easier to talk about loneliness? Because of course it's a bit of a taboo for quite a lot of people, because admitting you're lonely means that you're, the phrase sad and lonely, you're a bit of a outcast, etc. Do you think it's helped? Do you think that more people are experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, my hope is that there will be much less stigma around loneliness and around disclosing that one feels lonely. And I think realizing that one really isn't alone in these feelings. I mean, just realizing how significant the problem already was and how significant it is today makes it easier to admit it and then to do something about it, individually and of course collectively. So, and I think, one of the positive things that did come out of the last few months, I think was if I think back to those Thursday evenings when we stood on our doorsteps and beat our pots and pans and clapped and cheered the National Health Service and essential and key workers, it wasn't only kind of quite wonderful in that sense that we were celebrating them, but there was a sense of looking at your neighbours and looking at the people opposite in their windows, and a sense of kind of community that I think many of us had lost before. And I think our challenge moving forwards is to, of course, hold on to that and nurture it and amplify it. Because something that, as I was writing the book, became increasingly clear to me, and then I think lockdown made even clearer, was just how important our local neighbourhoods are and our local communities are in making us feel connected and less alone. And even those very micro exchanges we have, the hello to your greengrocer, the 10-second chat to your postman, the smile at somebody who's walking their dog in the park, even those small micro interactions play a huge role in making us feel less alone and more connected to each other.
So that, I mean, it's an interesting observation around, we talked about City Lit earlier in adult education, is that, obviously our primary purpose is to educate people, give people knowledge, skills, learning, etc. But the thing that I've become aware of in the last decade is just how important we are as kind of community and as social glue around well-being. And I particularly find, and it's all age groups. Some people will say, I'm the mad guy who asks people, what do you do in the lift? And then I kind of point to my badge for validation of the fact that I'm not just a random nutter. And it's people are saying, this is my tribe. This is my group of people. I come together every Tuesday and I do my calligraphy class or my ancient Greek class. And we all go downstairs and we have a coffee together afterwards and we chat. And some people have got a very full life in addition to that. But some people, that is the highlight of their week. And it's that piece of interaction, as you say, it's the saying hello to somebody at the counter behind Sainsbury's, or those different little touches of interaction or bigger touches of interaction are really, really important for people's well-being. And
I would argue that they're not only essential for well-being, and they really are. There was a study done where the researchers asked people to go into a coffee shop, and they said, you either have to go in and just order your coffee, or you have to go in and actually actively chat to the person making the coffee. And then they came out and they looked at how their mood was, and the ones who actually chatted, even just a few words, felt significantly better. So those micro interactions really matter, and it really affects our well-being. But I think it does something else too. I think it's in being part of a community and doing things like showing up and committing to show up and to show up again and again, in being part of a group of people where you have to listen to what they're saying and give and take, and through those sorts of skills of reciprocity and listening, that we also do something else. We practice democracy in its most inclusive form. And I think that's the value of in-person community interactions, which can be community at a very small scale, 8 people in a class. I think those are really important skills as well when you think about what society needs in order to function in an inclusive and healthy way.
That's great. And that leads us to a question we've had on the chat box. And it's the difference between loneliness and being alone. And how often they're conflated, I suppose, is one of those things. Because sometimes being alone is a good thing. Far from the maddening crowd, just getting away from things and stepping back can be positive and get your head in order. But it's that juxtaposition between the two. Did you explore that at all in the book?
Yes, definitely. And the question is absolutely right. You can be on your own and not feel lonely, and you can also be in a crowd of people and feel incredibly lonely, or be in a bad relationship and feel very lonely in your household as well. So the two don't necessarily fit together, although the research does show that if you live on your own, you are more likely to be lonely. So of course, that doesn't mean everyone who lives on their own is lonely, but if you live on your own, you are more likely to be lonely. And if you live on your own, you are more likely to be lonely more frequently too. But the two don't necessarily go hand in hand. And yes, I think there is if we think about kind of I'm somebody who actually likes spending a lot of time on my own. A lot of writers do, and there is a definite kind of positive aspect of solitude, of kind of being still and being with yourself, which is different, I would argue, to feeling lonely, which is feeling unsupported, feeling uncared for, feeling that you're craving intimacy, company, support, connection, and not getting it.
That's also the feels a little bit about an element of choice. Sometimes, I mean, I'm a chronic extrovert. I just love being around people, but sometimes I choose to be alone. I think I would never choose to be lonely. I think there's that difference, is being able to kind of move in and out of contact with people can be a positive, whereas being lonely means that you feel more and more disconnected. So you don't have the option to kind of re-engage as easily.
Yes, I think that's an important distinction, the lack of agency. Yeah.
So it's just, I mean, one of the things that everybody talks about around this, and you do address it a lot in your book, is the rise of social media and the whole element of that. And we chatted just before we came on live about the pros and cons of social media, and how sometimes it can be seen as a panacea for everything, and we can of course get in touch with people all around the world, and then of course it can be an evil as well. And what are your thoughts about this? The rise in loneliness, the rise in social media, are they correlated? Have they happened together? What are your kind of meta thoughts around this?
Well, when I started researching this book, I was keen to figure out what role our smartphones and social media play in today's loneliness crisis. And I was very neutral. I took kind of a very, I guess, dispassionate academic stance when I started doing my research. And of course, you're right. There are lots of examples of social media and our phones connecting us. Now, of course, in lockdown, for many of us, our phones have been our lifelines and our way of connecting with people. But more generally, if you're the LGBTQ kid growing up in a small village somewhere, and there's no one like you around, and you have found your people on Instagram, that will make you feel connected and part of a community in a way that you might not be able to have physically. So there clearly is a positive role that social media can play. And yet I came away from my research really feeling very strongly that social media and our smartphones are really making us so much lonelier. Yes, we can see a clear correlation between the rise in smartphone usage and social media usage, and the rise of loneliness. So the data kind of makes that clear. But up until about 2 years ago, it was hard to disentangle that and actually work out whether this was just the two things happening at the same time, or was it that lonely people used social media more, or was it that social media was making you lonely. But about 2 years ago, a couple of very important landmark studies took place. One at the American University, Stanford, a real gold standard of a study where they had 3,000 participants, 1,500 of which were told to use their social media as usual, and the other 1,500 were told to stop using social media. And what they found was that the 1,500 who stopped using social media, for 6 months, they tracked them, not only did more in person with friends and family, they spent less time on the internet in general, they were significantly happier and significantly less lonely. So staying off Facebook made people significantly less lonely. Our smartphones, they themselves, I mean, here I have mine near me. I mean, our smartphones ourselves, even without social media, are part of the problem. There was research done which showed that couples who put a smartphone on the table between them, who have a smartphone on the table between them, even if their smartphones are turned off, even if they're not even touching their smartphones, feel less empathy towards each other and less connected to each other. People smile less at strangers when they have their smartphones with them, even if they're not on their smartphones. So the devices themselves are problematic, but social media itself is just, it adds fuel to the fire, because these apps are designed essentially to keep us addicted, to keep us permanently connected, to keep us permanently distracted. And these weapons of mass destruction really stop us being present with each other. You know, we've all done it. We've been around our friends or family, you know, looking at our phones, not there with them, not present with them, which is contributing to loneliness. And there are actually quite moving stories about teenagers and children really suffering disproportionate levels of anxiety and depression and even eating disorders when their parents spend too much time on their phones. But social media is also problematic because it has a very excluding quality. And it was really my interviews with young people, with teenagers, that this came through really strongly. I spoke to one boy, Peter, a 14-year-old, and he told me so poignantly about how lonely he felt when he posted something on Instagram and then waiting, hoping that somebody would like it. And when they didn't, asking himself again and again, what am I doing wrong? Or Claudia, a teenager, who told me about how her friends had told her that they weren't going out and that they were not going out after a school event. And she was at home in her bedroom and she was scrolling on her social media and she saw them hanging out without her, having fun. And she felt so terrible and so isolated and so invisible, was the word she used, that she didn't go to school for a week and she hid in her room. And whereas, of course, in the past, it was always the case that, you know, there always could have been a child who was excluded, not asked to join in. In the past, an adult typically would see this was going on. So a teacher would see it, or a parent would see it, or a grandparent would see it, and they'd be able to intervene and do something. What's happening nowadays is that this exclusion is happening on a child's phone, and parents and grandparents and teachers are often just not aware that this is going on. And yet, to the child's peers, the exclusion is all too visible.
What's the issue? You're more likely to get a retweet if you post something angry. You provoke people. What's the background there? Because, you know, we've talked about the benign element of not feeling isolated if you're from a small community and different from the rest and stuff, but the element of anger. I mean, particularly, I got forced by work. I got eventually nagged into having Twitter. And I have to say, Twitter has its good side, but bloody hell, everybody just shouts at each other. I mean, it's a thing. And of course, the more you shout, I was very excited the other week. I got like 22 likes on something because I think I just post things that are quite, isn't this lovely and stuff like that. Whereas if you kind of want to kill 28 people or have Piers Morgan emasculated, you'll get thousands of likes and retweets and everything. So what's this thing about anger and rage?
Well, there's actually research that was done which showed that you put in a word like hate, kill, attack in your post, it's significantly more likely to be reposted, retweeted. And, you know, this is all feeding our kind of dopamine highs. When we see a like, or when we see a retweet, it actually makes us feel good, physiologically, chemically feel good. So so people do what they can in order to be retweeted. When you're not retweeted and when you're not liked, Mark, when you post something and nobody likes it, or it actually feels painful as well. So these are kind of physiological responses, and social media companies have designed their products in that way, in the same way that slot machines are designed to keep you putting your money in. Social media is designed to keep you scrolling on it, to keep you on it, to keep you tweeting, to keep you using it, because that's how they make their money, the companies. The longer you're on it, the more you're using it, the more you're interacting on it, the more data they have on you, and the more they can sell ads to you. And so based on you. So they're designed to kind of inspire this hate and malice and anger. And actually 60% of young British people have been cyberbullied, have experienced cyberbullying, which is an incredibly high number when you think about it. Personally, I block anyone on my social media who says anything nasty. I mean, life is way too short to put, I think, negative people into your own life. If you can, ban them. But the social media companies they could tweak their algorithm so that kind posts rose more than hateful posts. They could, as actually is being piloted in some cases, you know, they could ask you, do you really want to say this before you tweet something mean? I mean, there are things they could do. And there are also things governments surely could do when it comes to better regulating these companies, when it comes to how they allow hate, hate speech, anti-Semitism, racist speech, to just sexist speech, homophobic speech, to just circulate on their platforms with impunity.
Which brings us beautifully to Donald Trump in a number of ways. The rise you talked about earlier, and you talk about quite a lot in the book, about the rise of the right, populism. And you've seen it, as you say, in Europe. Trump is I mean, he and his Twitter account are indistinguishable as entities. And he has made a career, partly as a celebrity on The Apprentice, but also because of his Twitter account. He is probably the first kind of global leader who kind of got there because of that. And it's used to bully, it's used to hate. So it's interesting, we talk about the rise of the right, but also the fact that they've got very good at using these tools, both in terms of social media, but also you talk in your book about kind of the sense of community of I go to a meeting of my local political party and I get my community that way. So talk to me a little bit about this political phenomenon and in its multifaceted ways.
So I was trying to understand why we were seeing this significant rise in people voting for right-wing populists. And I started digging into the academic literature on this. One thing that struck me was that from about 1992, there was a clear link that researchers found between people who felt socially isolated and people voting for right-wing populist parties. In 1992, researchers in France found a link between Le Pen voters and people who felt socially isolated. But then later, if we look at Trump voters, for example, research that was done on Trump voters, comparing them to Hillary Clinton voters or Bernie Sanders voters in 2016, found that Donald Trump voters were much less likely to say that they had friends, much more likely to answer that they could only rely on themselves in times of need. So again, there was a kind of data, a pool of data suggesting that there was something going on there. And then I started interviewing right-wing populist voters across the globe. And what I found from people like Eric, the Le Pen voter in France, a baker, a 20-something-year-old baker, was that his life had been, as he put it, very lonely until he found a community in Le Pen and in Rassemblement National, which is what Front National is now called in France, France's right-wing populist party. And he told me about how he would on Wednesday nights meet up with fellow members and how they would leaflet and then they would go for drinks afterwards. Or Giorgio, a Salvini voter in Italy, would tell me about how there would be dinners that he would attend where they would all sing together and sing traditional songs, and how he felt part of a community. Or in Belgium, Vlaams Belang, the far-right populist party, has gatherings, festivals, where inside they have anti-immigrant speeches about the dangers of immigrants, and outside they have face painting and bouncy castles for the kids. Or think about Trump's rallies, of course, which he was so desperate to get going again, even through this pandemic. But if you think about those rallies, all those people crushed together, singing, chanting, wearing red outfits and their MAGA baseball caps, wanting to be part of a community. So right-wing populists, and again, this isn't that everyone who's lonely is going to vote for a right-wing populist. Of course, that isn't what I'm saying. But what right-wing populists are doing better than any other party is speaking to a loneliness and a sense of disconnection that many of their followers feel, and delivering a theatre of community, a spectacle of community, in a way that others really haven't managed to do. Realizing as well that perhaps there's no easier way to offer community than by also making very clear who isn't invited in. And so their community is, of course, a very exclusive and excluding community, a community defined as much by who is not allowed in, build the wall, keep the foreigners out, with that sort of rhetoric. And again, that speaks disproportionately to the lonely, because research shows that people who are lonely do perceive the world as a more hostile, threatening place, do perceive the world, and again, this is on average, it's not everyone, of course, who's lonely who sees the world like this, but do on average feel more threatened by outsiders. And right-wing populists have in a way weaponized community in order to target this constituency.
So that's fascinating, because if you think back to the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it was actually the left that mobilized community very effectively. The Labour Party wasn't just a political party, it was a movement, it was attached to the trade unions, the interconnection, the miners' galas, the social clubs, everything. So kind of how I'm intrigued, because you're absolutely right. I mean, if I think about it, but then that kind of pivot of the left losing that sense of community, but the right kind of taking it over. What do you think happened there? Or is it, that's just a too big a question, I think?
Well, you mentioned trade unions, and trade unions historically did play a huge part in, especially for working class men, creating community, creating a sense of togetherness, solidarity, brotherhood. And we have seen a decline in trade union membership steadily, really, ever since kind of Thatcher and Reagan actively sought to destroy them, but really kind of since the 1980s onwards. So that clearly has played a part. I think the changing nature of work plays a part here as well. People typically in the past had jobs with history, jobs that had status within their community. Increasingly, many such jobs have been replaced by low pay, low status, less secure work, where again, you don't have that community that comes from the workplace. I actually heard from a number of railroad workers in the United States who had been traditionally Democrat voters. So their families had voted for many generations Democrat, who in 2016 had decided to vote for Trump because they felt that the Democrats no longer spoke for them, that they felt that they'd been ignored, because that's, I think, again, the left, did embrace this model, this very harsh form of capitalism that we've talked about, neoliberalism, really kind of through the Blair years onwards, and also embraced notions like austerity, really, and at a cost to many people, didn't address some of the key concerns that many, especially working class people, had about their jobs, about their security, about their environments. And the left, did fail, I think, many people. And that's the challenge that the left really has now. How do they reconnect with that constituency? And how do they reconnect with this, with the feelings? How do they address the feelings that people have? Because I think if there's one thing we've learned in recent years, is that people vote on feelings much more than facts.
What are your thoughts? We talked about society as a whole, but you just mentioned work. So obviously the nature of work has changed enormously over the last 50 years, from, as you say, collectivism, union, quite long to high union presence, to much more office work, and now suddenly we're now in a situation where so many people are working from home, and that is. And whether we go back, people, the donutting of London, the hollow. If I go into Covent Garden at the moment, it's desolate. So you walk over to the city, it's desolate. Whereas actually out in West London, where I live, the local sort of areas are very, very vibrant. So what do you think is going to happen in terms of the nature? What do you think is going to happen to the nature of work, and what do you think should? Because I think they could be very different. As a result of pandemic?
Well, firstly, I think there is a thinking error taking place at the moment, that a lot of businesses are saying that where we are today is the new normal. And they're making these kind of statements that this is how things will now be. We're never going to go back to everyone being in the office. Remote work is the new normal. I actually think we're way too early in the crisis to be able to make such statements. And I do worry that some of the motivation for companies making that statements is they're just thinking, well, we can slash our real estate costs, and not think about the well-being of their staff. Because even though the workplace actually was a pretty lonely place for many people before the pandemic, 60% of British office workers felt lonely at work before the pandemic. What is clear from research that was done on remote workers, again, before the pandemic, is that remote working, loneliness, is one of the key problems that remote workers confront. And there was a study actually done, an experiment done in China a few years ago, where a very big company, half of the employees were given the opportunity, well, actually told to work from home for 6 months. And then after 6 months, they were asked whether they wanted to go back into the office. And most of them did choose to go back into the office. So we may get to a point, I think, where going in every single day isn't necessarily the norm. But I think we lose something when we don't have enough face-to-face interaction in the workplace. And I think as workplaces kind of redesign themselves moving forward, I think they should be very careful not to lose that, and not to get so caught up in the we can save costs that they forget that. There was some fascinating research done with firefighters in America. Firefighting companies where the firefighters ate together performed twice as well as firefighter companies when the firefighters didn't eat together. And I found that really fascinating. And in case of firefighters, it's obviously a matter of life and death, how well they perform. But I think it spoke to a real truth about how, as we redesign the workplace, how do we build community back into it? Partly in a very simple way, through eating together, enabling staff to eat together. Another experiment was done where everyone had their breaks at the same time in a company. Radically changed how people felt and how lonely or not or otherwise they felt. So, I think there are some kind of really small hacks that can make a difference, but loneliness is also about people feeling visible. And I think workplaces have a way to go in terms of making their employees feel visible, feel heard, feel listened to. And again, I would hope that as we rebuild the workplace, there are things that can be done on that front too there. And there are some initiatives that some companies are doing in that way that are really inspiring.
I think it's ironic, isn't it, that some of the companies that are doing some of the best work in this area around social architecture, physical architecture of buildings, are the social media companies. So, the Apples and the Googles are trying to create an incredibly positive work environment where people interact, etc. And the irony is beyond belief in a lot of ways, but there is some very good work, particularly coming out of California, around that, of going, how do you make people more interact with each other? Because obviously, the more people interact, arguably the more creative they are and the more ideas they're exposed to.
Although, interestingly, the social media companies all went down, apart from Apple, actually, the others, so Facebook and Google, we went down the open plan office route. So they designed offices with, no walls, no cubicles, and just open plan. And ostensibly so that people could collaborate more. But actually, the research shows that when people move from a cubicle type office or an office where you can shut doors to an open plan office, people interact significantly less with each other, surprisingly, face to face, and do much more on email. And I worked in an open plan office, and I remember I used to have like headphones that I would put on in the room because I really couldn't concentrate when everyone was speaking around me, and there were lots of people with headphones on, so it makes it really hard to interact. And also there's something about the performative nature of an open plan office where you can't really be authentic and you can't really confide in those around you because everyone else is listening in. So you can't go, I had a really bad day, or having a problem with my boss or anything like that. So so people become more disconnected from themselves in those environments. So I think the tech companies have paid lip service to the idea of kind of collaboration in the workplace, but I'm not sure how well they're actually delivering on it.
Oh, the irony of it. I put open plan in about 5 years ago, and
Sorry,
everybody who hates me at work now will hate me even more and go, well, Noreena said, so thank God I'm working remotely. Anyway, that was no. I mean, but it is interesting about these trends where you think certain things will have effects, and I've seen positives and negatives from open plan in the way that it's kind of implemented. In the last few minutes, I mean, the hour's just flown by, but I love the fact that you end the book with almost a manifesto of what governments, businesses, individuals, and it's everybody's responsibility for doing this. So do you want to talk a little bit about what, we've talked about quite a lot of the negatives, but you end on a note of, if we do something about this, there's a way forward.
Yes, and actually just to reassure viewers, the book is full of hope and inspiration and loads of brilliant ideas about how we can come together again throughout the book. But in the last chapter, I guess I crystallize it. And I do believe change is possible. And I do believe that we can have a more connected, less lonely world in which we come together again. But I do believe that in order to get there, there are things that governments, businesses, and we as individuals do need to do. Just a few things that governments can do. First, absolutely essential is to invest in the infrastructure of community. It is a travesty that since 2008, we've seen 600 public libraries be closed down in the UK. We've seen a third of youth clubs shut down. We've seen day centres shut down. We've seen elderly day centres shut down. We've seen community centres shut down. people need to have physical spaces where they can meet, interact, do things together, and governments have a clear role to play in funding that. Governments also have a really significant role that they could play in regenerating our local high streets. In Belgium, for example, landlords are given a tax. There is a tax on empty shops that landlords have to pay as a way of disincentivizing landlords from keeping shops empty whilst they're waiting for higher rents to come in. I think that's something that could be emulated. There's also an argument for creating a new type of community categorization of shops. So if you think about something like a bookshop, something that really serves the local community, these could be called pro-community businesses, and they should have special tax breaks. So lots that governments can do. And when it comes to social media, of course, at a minimum, social media companies should have a duty of care so that people who use their platforms are not subjected to bullying, hate, and vitriol. Much more that governments can do too, but businesses have a clear role that they can play, a role that they can play in making their employees feel more connected to each other in very practical ways. We talked about having lunch at the same time, facilitating lunches for employees, having breaks at the same time, making sure that employees are heard, explicitly valuing kindness, collaboration, helping each other in their staff. These are things companies can do, as well as, of course, treat their employees well. That's a no-brainer, and that needs to be non-negotiable. However they might classify their workers. And we as individuals have things that we, of course, can do too. I mean, just 4 things to suggest. First, we should try and put down our phones more and be more present with each other. I literally try and put my phone physically out of arm's reach in the evening so that I'm not tempted to reach out for it, so that I can be present with my partner. We need to support our local communities more, shop in our local shops, show up at community events, initiate community events if we can, just smile more, say thank you more to those around us, whether it is our greengrocer, our neighbour, or even our Alexa. And finally, I think we all have a responsibility now more than ever to think about, is there someone in our own network who might be lonely? And if there is, reach out to them, pick up the phone, arrange to meet them for a socially distanced catch up. Just showing someone that we see them, that they're visible, that we hear them, can make a huge difference to someone else's life. And if we're feeling lonely ourselves, one thing to do is, or 2 things to do. One, do see whether there is, whether on CityLit or elsewhere, a course, an activity, something that speaks to something that you're interested in, that you could join, because that's a great way to find community with people who have shared interests to you. But also think, is there a way that you can help someone else? Because helping someone else not only helps them, but makes you feel more connected to each other.
Noreena, that's an incredibly life-affirming way to end, actually. A real, as I said, manifesto for starting to right some of the wrongs that have been going on. As I said, the hour has just flown away. The book, ladies and gentlemen, is brilliant. My colleague Sam has put it in the chat box. It's there. You can buy it at all good bookshops. I went and got mine at Waterstones. You can get it on Amazon. It's great because actually what it is Noreena goes to show that economists are not dry, soulless people. They are people with flair and imagination. And actually it's incredibly human. The lovely thing about it is all of these individual stories about people, individual, real people who are living lives and that you can empathize with and sympathize with. And it's really good from that perspective. So I think there are certain books that happen along every 2 or 3 years that kind of cross over from being a kind of academic, or is this important, to being ones that actually think are pretty much book must reads for everybody in society. I think this is this year's one. I really do. So Noreena, thank you for giving us your hour tonight. Hopefully the book sells even better than it's doing already. I know it's going fabulously. Hopefully the Dutch and the Norwegian launches go well over the next few weeks, and good luck with it. But a brilliant hour with you. Thank you for sharing it with us. And I think on behalf of all, I'm seeing streams of people saying thank you. So take care, and we'll hopefully have you back for the next book, because I'm sure whatever the next book will be, it'll be equally fascinating in a year or so's time.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Brilliant. And thank you everybody for coming. There are a lot more events over the course of the next 3 days. So go on CityLit's website and you'll see all sorts of lectures, panels, events, group activities that you can take part in. But for tonight, thank you. Good luck. And again, thank you to Noreena. It was just wonderful. Thank you.